This just in, a research team in the University of California, Davis has found that incorporating seaweed into cattle's daily diet may be the key to reducing the cattle's methane production. The leading researcher and a PhD student at UC Davis, Brianna Michelle Roque, is here with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us a general overview of your study?
Thank you for having me. My central focus has always been climate change. The world is becoming hotter and more chaotic. There are so many causes of climate change, but the main cause is the rapid rise of greenhouse gas emissions. We are at incredibly high levels of carbon dioxide and methane, which are two main greenhouse gases, and the levels are constantly increasing. This is directly correlated to the constant rise in temperatures, so it is clear that greenhouse gas emissions should be a top priority for climate change scientists. My team and I wanted to figure out a simple solution to reduce at least one of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. We decided to place our main focus on cattle. Our main questions were, is there a simple way to decrease the amount of methane emissions that occur due to the digestive processes of cows? And 2, can we find an innovative solution that is easy and ethical to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Our hypothesis was that if the Asparagopsis taxiformis, which is a red marine seaweed, was incorporated into a small percentage of the feed of beef cattle, then digestive methane emissions would decrease significantly. The experiment was 4 days long, and we studied the effect of A. taxiformis on the rumen, which is the first stomach of the cattle that partially digests the food and produces methane. So what was your reasoning for picking cattle as your main focus? How do they relate to climate change?
Yes.
If we look at the US, 11% of greenhouse gas emissions are methane. Methane traps heat around 28 times more effectively than carbon dioxide, so even though methane does not make up the majority of greenhouse gas emissions, methane is one of the most responsible for the temperature increase that we have seen. Fermentation that occurs in the intestines of ruminant animals, such as cattle, produce 25% of that methane. So cattle are significant producers of methane. Would you mind explaining the study in more detail related to the evidence? We collected rumen solids and liquids and homogenized them for 24 hours. Then we made a sort of artificial gut system to mimic live cattle's digestive systems. We incorporated A. taxiformis at 5% of the overall feed and tested each system. We then checked during several incubation times of 4 hours apart because the reaction was immediate. For the total gas produced, the control group produced 28.54 milliliters per gram of organic matter, while the treatment group produced 14.18 milliliters per gram of organic matter. This was a 51.8% reduction in total gas production. The average methane production for the control group was 12.08 milliliters per gram. For the treatment group, it was 0.59 milliliter per gram. This was a 95% reduction of methane. Regarding CO2 production, there were no observable differences that could be found between the CO2 production of control versus treatment, but the significant reduction in methane has promising implications for using seaweed in the feed of beef cattle. Additionally, we found that the treatment groups had higher levels of calcium, sodium, magnesium, iron, and manganese concentrations and had no dangerous effect to the gut system. So this indicates that the seaweed is not dangerous but actually beneficial to the animals. So, what was the conclusion of your study, and have you found any other results that could support that? The primary conclusion of my study was that using A. taxiformis in the feed of cattle will reduce enteric methane emissions, or methane emissions that occur due to the intestines, by a significant amount. After our study was done,
We did a similar experiment with real cows and with A. armata, which is a similar species of seaweed. We found that if the diet contained 0.5% seaweed, there was a 26% decrease in methane. If the diet included 1%, there was a 67% decrease in methane. Currently, we are trying a similar experiment with a taxiformist to see whether there are differences in the species of seaweed used, and if there are, which species are better for methane reduction. However, both experiments lead to the same conclusion. Using small amounts of seaweed to cattle feed will reduce the amount of digestive methane emissions severely. Why exactly does seaweed lead to the reduction of methane production? A. taxiformis and A. armata have several anti-methanogenic compounds such as bromoform, which is the most abundant and which binds to vitamin B12 as an inhibitor. Vitamin B12 has a similar shape to coenzyme F430, which is a cofactor that is used in methanogenesis, or the formation of methane. If vitamin B12 is binded to bromoform, then it cannot function as a precursor for methanogenesis, so methanogenesis does not occur. Okay, great. Once again, thanks so much for being here. Today we learned that the physiological processes of the cattle's digestive systems lead to methane production, and with our current situation, we should work towards decreasing any large-scale greenhouse gas emissions. In my opinion, I feel excited by the potential of such a simple change and how it can reduce a major greenhouse gas by so much. The data that Roque collected serves as clear evidence that methane production decreased by 95% compared to the control when just 5% of the feed was made up of a seaweed species. Now, farmers and others in the agricultural business can incorporate these results into their own beef cattle feed. This is an efficient, creative, and innovative way to limit the amount of methane emissions, and this puts us one step closer to preventing drastic climate change. I do, however, have some questions that we should consider for future studies. Are there any other animals that could be slightly altered to help fight against climate change, or their lifestyles could be changed by a little? Are there any other plants that can also be used instead of seaweed for cattle? And finally, how should we all prioritize the various sources of climate change? I'm Nitya Kumar, and this has been US News.